Hey everyone. Every year I do a personal challenge, so something like writing an AI to help control my home or trying to learn Mandarin. For the last couple of years, I've focused most of my time on addressing some of the biggest social issues facing Facebook and the internet overall. And we made a lot of progress on these, but there's still a lot more to do. That's going to continue to be a focus for a while. This year, though, my challenge is to get out and to have a series of discussions on the future of technology and the internet and how that's going to affect our society. So big questions around how we can keep on giving people a voice, where we want to encrypt things, and things like where we can decentralize the tools that we give people. There are a lot of important questions to ask here. So today, I am in Boston, and I'm heading over to Cambridge to have a discussion with Professor Jonathan Zittrain, who's the head of the Berkman Klein Center and a professor at Harvard Law. And he's one of the foremost experts at the intersection of technology and law and how these issues relate to society. So I'm looking forward to having this conversation, and thank you for tuning in.
So thank you, Mark, for coming to talk to me and to our students from the Techtopia program and from my Internet and Society course at Harvard Law School. We're really pleased to have a chance to talk about any number of issues, and we should just dive right in. So privacy, autonomy, and information fiduciaries.
All right.
I'd love to talk about that.
I read your piece in the New York Times.
The one with the headline that said, Mark Zuckerberg can fix this mess?
Yeah. Although that was last year.
That's true. Are you suggesting it's all fixed?
No.
Okay, good. So
I'm suggesting that I'm curious whether you still think that we can fix this mess.
I hope springs eternal is my motto. So all right, let me give a quick characterization of this idea that the coinage and the scaffolding for it is from my colleague Jack Balkin at Yale. And the two of us have been developing it out further. There are a standard number of privacy questions with which you might have some familiarity, having to do with people conveying information that they know they're conveying or they're not so sure they are, but mouse droppings, as we used to call them, when they run in the rafters of the internet and leave traces. And then the standard way of talking about that is you want to make sure that that stuff doesn't go where you don't want it to go. I might call that informational privacy. We don't want people to know stuff that we want maybe our friends only to know. And on a place like Facebook, you're supposed to be able to tweak your settings and say, give them to this and not to that. But there's also ways in which stuff that we share with consent could still sort of be used against us. And it feels like, well, you consented may not end the discussion. And the analogy that my colleague Jack brought to bear was one of a doctor and a patient, or a lawyer and a client, or sometimes in America, but not always, a financial advisor and a client, that says that those professionals have certain expertise. They get trusted with all sorts of sensitive information from their clients and patients. And so they have an extra duty to act in the interests of those clients, even if their own interests conflict. And so maybe just one quick hypo to get us started. I wrote a piece in 2014 that maybe you read that was a hypothetical about elections, in which it said, just hypothetically, imagine that Facebook had a view about which candidate should win, and they reminded people likely to vote for the favored candidate that it was election day, and to others they simply set a cat photo. Would that be wrong? And I find, I have no idea if it's illegal. It does seem wrong to me, and it might be that the fiduciary approach captures what makes it wrong.
All right, so I think we could probably spend the whole next hour just talking about that. So I read your op-ed, and I also read Balkin's blog post on information fiduciaries, and I've had a conversation with him too.
Great.
And at first blush, kind of reading through this, my reaction is there's a lot here that makes sense, right? I mean, the idea of of us having a fiduciary relationship with the people who use our services is kind of intuitively, it's how we think about building what we're building, right? So reading through this, it's like, all right, a lot of people seem to have this mistaken notion that when we're putting together newsfeed and doing ranking, that we have a team of people who are focused on maximizing the time that people spend. But that's not the goal that we give them. We tell people on the team produce the service that we think is going to be the highest quality. That we try to ground it in kind of getting people to come in and tell us, right, of the content that we could potentially show, what is going to be. They tell us what they want to see, and then we build models that can predict that and build that service.
And by the way, was that always the case, or was that a place you got to through some course adjustments?
Through course adjustments. I mean, you start off using simpler signals like what people are clicking on in feed, but then you pretty quickly learn, hey, that gets you to a local optimum, right? Where if you're focusing on what people click on and predicting what people click on, then you select for clickbait, right? So pretty quickly you realize from real feedback from real people, that's not actually what people want. You're not going to build the best service by doing that. So you bring in people and actually have these panels of, we call it getting to ground truth. Of you show people all the candidates for what can be shown to them, and you have people say, what's the most meaningful thing that I wish that this system were showing us? So all this is kind of a way of saying that our own self-image of ourselves and what we're doing is that we're acting as fiduciaries and trying to build the best services for people. Where I think that this ends up getting interesting is then the question of who gets to decide in the legal sense or the policy sense of what's in people's best interest, right? So we come in every day and think, hey, we're building a service where we're ranking newsfeed, trying to show people the most relevant content with an assumption that's backed by data that in general, people want us to show them the most relevant content. But at some level, you could ask the question, which is, who gets to decide that ranking newsfeed or showing relevant ads or any of the other things that we choose to work on are actually in people's interest? And we're doing the best that we can to try to build the service that we think are the best. At the end of the day, a lot of this is grounded in people choose to use it, right? Because clearly they're getting some value from it. But then there are all these questions, like you say, about you have about where people can effectively give consent and not.
Yes.
So I think that there's a lot of interesting questions in this to unpack about how you'd actually implement a model like that. But at a high level, I think one of the things that I think about in terms of we're running this big company. It's important in society that people trust the institutions of society. Clearly, I think we're in a position now where people rightly have a lot of questions about big internet companies, Facebook in particular. And I do think getting to a point where there's like the right regulation and rules in place just provides a kind of societal guardrail framework where people can have confidence that, okay, these companies are operating within a framework that we've all agreed. That's better than them just doing whatever they want, and I think that would give people confidence. So figuring out what that framework is, I think, is a really important thing, and I'm sure we'll talk about that as it relates to a lot of the content areas today. But getting to that question of how do you, who determines what's in people's best interest, if not people themselves, is a really interesting question.
Yes. So we should surely talk about that. So on our agenda is the who decides question. Other agenda items include, just as you say, the fiduciary framework sounds nice to you, doctors, patients, Facebook users, and I hear you saying that's pretty much where you're wanting to end up anyway. There are some interesting questions about what people want versus what they want to want.
Yeah.
People will say, on January 1st, what I want, New Year's resolution, is a gym membership. And then on January 2nd, they don't want to go to the gym. They want to go to the gym, but they never quite make it. And then, of course, a business model of pay for the whole year ahead of time, and they know you'll never turn up, develops around that. And I guess a specific area to delve into for a moment on that might be on the advertising side of things. Maybe the dichotomy between personalization and does it ever go into exploitation? Now, there might be stuff. I know Facebook, for example, bans payday loans as best it can. That's just a substantive area that it's like, all right, we don't want to do that. But when we think about good personalization, so that Facebook knows I have a dog and not a cat, and a targeter can then offer me dog food and not cat food, how about, if not now, a future day in which an advertising platform can offer to an ad targeter some sense of, I just lost my pet, I'm really upset, I'm ready to make some snap decisions that I might regret later, but when I make them, I'm going to make them. So this is the perfect time to tee up a cubic zirconia or whatever the thing is that... That seems to me a fiduciary approach would say, ideally, how we get there, I don't know, but ideally, we wouldn't permit that kind of approach to somebody using the information we've gleaned from them to know they're in a tough spot and then to exploit them. But I don't know how you would think about something like that. Could you write an algorithm to detect something like that?
Well, I think one of the key principles is that we're trying to run this company for the long term, right? And I think that people think that a lot of things that if you were just trying to optimize the profits for next quarter or something like that, you might want to do things that people might like in the near term, but over the long term will come to resent. But if you actually care about building a community and achieving this mission and building the company for the long term, I think you're much more aligned than people often think companies are. And it gets back to the idea before where, I think like our self-image is largely acting as in this kind of fiduciary relationship, as you're saying, which is, and across, we could probably go through a lot of different examples. I mean, we don't want to show people content that they're going to click on and engage with, but then feel like they wasted their time afterwards. Where we don't want to show them things that they're going to make a decision based off of that and then regret later. I think that there's a hard balance here, which is, I mean, if you're talking about what people want to want versus what they want, often people's revealed preferences of what they actually do shows a deeper sense of what they want than what they think they want to want. So I think that there's a question between when something is exploitative versus when something is real but isn't what you would say that you want.
Yes.
And that's a really hard thing to get at.
Yes.
But on a lot of these cases, my experience of running the company is that you start off building a system, you have relatively unsophisticated signals to start, and you build up increasingly complex models over time that try to take into account more of what people care about. And I mean, there are all these examples that we can go through. I think probably newsfeed and ads are probably the two most complex ranking examples that we have. But it's like we were talking about a second ago. I mean, when we started off with the systems, I mean, just start with newsfeed, but you could do this on ads too. The most naive signals are what people click on, what people like. But then you just very quickly realize that doesn't, it approximates something, but it's a very crude approximation of the ground truth of what people actually care about. So what you really want to get to is, as much as possible, getting real people to look at the real candidates for content and tell you in a multi-dimensional way what matters to them and try to build systems that model that. And then you want to be kind of conservative on preventing downside. So your example of the payday loans, when we've talked about this in the past, you've put the question to me of, how do you know when a payday loan is going to be exploitative, right? If you're targeting someone who is in a bad situation. And our answer is, well, we don't really know when it's going to be exploitative, but we think that the whole category potentially has a massive risk of that, so we just ban it.
Which makes it an easy case, but yes.
Yes. And I think that the harder cases are when there's significant upside and significant downside, and you want to weigh both of them. So, I mean, for example, after, once we started putting together a really big effort on preventing election interference, one of the initial ideas that came up was, why don't we just ban all ads that relate to anything that is political? And then, okay, you pretty quickly get into, all right, well, what's a political ad? The classic legal definition is things that are around elections and candidates, but that's not actually what Russia and other folks were primarily doing, right? It's a lot of the issues that we've seen are around issue ads, right, and basically sowing division on what are social issues. So, all right, I don't think you're going to get in the way of people's speech and ability to promote and do advocacy on issues that they care about. But so then the question is, all right, well, so then what's the right balance of how do you make sure that you're providing the right level of controls that people who aren't supposed to be participating in these debates aren't, or that at least you're providing the right transparency. But I think we've veered a little bit from the original question. But
yes.
But yeah, okay. So let's get back to where you were.
Well, here's, I mean, this is a way of maybe moving it forward, which is a platform as complete as Facebook is these days offers lots of opportunities to shape what people see and possibly to help them with those nudges that it's time to go to the gym or to avoid them from falling into the depredations of a payday loan. And there is a question of, so long as the platform is in a position to do it, does it now have an ethical obligation to do it, to help people achieve the good life? And I worry that it is too great a burden for any company to bear to have to figure out, say, if not the perfect, the most reasonable news feed for every one of the, how many? 2.5 billion active users? Something like that.
Yeah, on that order.
All the time. And there might be some ways that start a little bit to get into the engineering of the thing that would say, okay, with all hindsight, are there ways to architect this so that the stakes aren't as high, aren't as focused on just, gosh, is Facebook doing this right? It's as if there were only one newspaper in the whole world, or one or two. And it's like, well, then what the New York Times chooses to put on its homepage, if it were the only newspaper, would have outsize importance. So just as a technical matter, a number of the students in this room had a chance to hear from Tim Berners-Lee, inventor of the World Wide Web. And he has a new idea for something called Solid. I don't know if you've heard of Solid. It's a protocol more than it is like a product, so there's no car to move off the lot today. But its idea is allowing people to have the data that they generate as they motor around the web end up in their own kind of data locker. Now, for somebody like Tim, it might mean literally in a locker under his desk, and he could wake up in the middle of the night and see where his data is. For others, it might mean a rack somewhere, guarded perhaps by a fiduciary who's looking out for them, the way that we put money in a bank, and then we can sleep at night knowing the bankers are, it's maybe not the best analogy in 2019, but blockchain. We'll get there. But Solid says if you did that, people would then, or their helpful proxies, be able to say, all right, Facebook is coming along, it wants the following data from me, and including data that it has generated about me as I use it, but stored back in my locker. And it kind of has to come back to my well to draw water each time. And that way, if I want to switch to Schmacebook or something, it's still in my well, and I can just immediately grant permission to Schmacebook to see it. I don't have to do a kind of data slurp and then re-upload it. It's a fully distributed way of thinking about data. And I'm curious, from an engineering perspective, does this seem doable with something of the size and the number of spinning wheels that Facebook has? And does it seem like a... Yeah. I'm curious your reaction to an idea like that.
So I think it's quite interesting. Certainly the level of computation that Facebook is doing and all the services that we're building is really intense to do in a distributed way. I mean, I think as a basic model, I think we're building out the data center capacity over the next 5 years, in our plan for what we think we need to do, that we think is on the order of all of what AWS and Google Cloud are doing for supporting all of their customers. So this is like a relatively computationally intense thing. Over time, you assume you'll get more compute, so decentralized things which are less efficient computationally will be harder. They're harder to do computation on, but eventually maybe you have the compute resources to do that. I think the more interesting questions there are not feasibility in the near term, but are the philosophical questions of the goodness of a system like that. So, one question, if you want to, so we can get into decentralization. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is a use of blockchain that I am potentially interested in, although I haven't figured out a way to make this work out, is around authentication and bringing and basically granting access to your information to different services. So basically replacing the notion of what we have with Facebook Connect with something that's fully distributed.
Do you want to log in with your Facebook account? Is the status
quo?
Or
you basically take your information, you store it on some decentralized system, and you have the choice of whether to log in to different places, and you're not going through an intermediary, which is kind of like what you're suggesting here in a sense. Okay, now there's a lot of things that I think would be quite attractive about that. For developers, one of the things that is really troubling about working with our system, or Google's system for that matter, or having to deliver your services through Apple's App Store, is you don't want to have an intermediary between serving the people who are using your service and you, right? Where someone can just say, hey, we as a developer have to follow your policy, and if we don't, then you can cut off access to the people we're serving. That's kind of a difficult and troubling position to be in. So I think
tell if you're referring to a recent incident.
I was sure, but I think it underscores the. I think every developer probably feels this. People are using any app store, but also login with Facebook, with Google, any of these services.
Yes.
You want a direct relationship with the people you serve. Now, okay, but let's look at the flip side. So what we saw in the last couple of years with Cambridge Analytica was basically an example where people chose to take data that they there was some of it was their data, some of it was data that they had seen from their friends, right? Because if you want to do things like making it so alternative services can build a competing news feed, then you need to be able to make it so that people can bring the data that they see within the system. Okay, so basically people chose to give their data to a developer who's affiliated with Cambridge University, which is a really respected institution, and then that developer turned around and sold the data to the firm Cambridge Analytica, which is in violation of our policies. So we cut off the developer's access, and of course in a fully distributed system, there would be no one who could cut off the developer's access. So the question is, if you have a fully distributed system, it dramatically empowers individuals on the one hand, but it really raises the stakes, and it gets to your questions around, well, what are the boundaries on consent and how people can really actually effectively know that they're giving consent to an institution. In some ways, it's a lot easier to regulate and hold accountable large companies like Facebook or Google because they're more visible, they're more transparent than the long tail of services that people would choose to then go interact with directly. So I think this is a really interesting social question. Yes. To some degree, I think this idea of going in the direction of like blockchain authentication is less gated on the technology and capacity to do that. I think if you were doing fully decentralized Facebook, that would take massive computation, but I'm sure we could do fully decentralized authentication if we wanted to. I think the real question is, do you really want that?
Yes.
Right, and I think you'd have more cases where, yes, people would be able to not have an intermediary, but you'd also have more cases of abuse, and the recourse would be much harder.
Yes. I mean, what I hear you saying is people, as they go about their business online, are generating data about themselves that's quite valuable, if not to themselves, to others who might interact with them. And the more they are empowered, possibly through a distributed system, to decide where that data goes and with whom they want to share it, the more they could be exposed to exploitation. This is a genuine dilemma, because I'm a huge fan of decentralization. But I also see the problem. And maybe one answer is there's some data that's just so toxic, there's no vessel we should put it in. It might eat a hole through it or something, metaphorically speaking. But then again, innocuous data can so quickly be assembled into something scary. So I don't know
that's what
collection.
We're saying. I mean, I think in general, we're talking about the large scale of data being assembled into meaning something different from what the individual data points mean.
Yes.
And I think that's the whole challenge here. But I philosophically agree with you that I mean, I want to think about, I do think about the work that we're doing as a decentralizing force in the world, right? A lot of the reason why I think people of my generation got into technology is because we believe that technology gives individuals power and isn't massively centralizing. Now, you've built a bunch of big companies in the process, but I think that what has largely happened is that individuals today have more voice, more ability to affiliate with who they want and stay connected with people, ability to form communities in ways that they couldn't before. And I think that that's massively empowering to individuals, and that's philosophically kind of the side that I tend to be on. So that's why I'm thinking about going back to decentralized or blockchain authentication. That's why I'm like kind of bouncing around. How could you potentially make this work? Because from my orientation is to try to go in that direction.
Yes.
An example where I think we're generally a lot closer to going in that direction is encryption. I mean, this is like I think one of the really big debates today is basically where are the boundaries on where you would want a messaging service to be encrypted, and there are all these benefits from a privacy and security perspective. But on the other hand of what we're trying to do, one of the big issues that we're grappling with is content governance and where's the line between free expression and I suppose privacy on one side, but safety on the others. People do really bad things, right, some of the time. And I think people rightfully have an expectation of us that we're going to do everything we can to stop terrorists from recruiting people or people from exploiting children or doing different things. And moving in the direction of making these systems more encrypted certainly reduces some of the signals that we would have access to be able to do some of that really important work.
Yes.
But here we are, right? We're sitting in this position where we're running WhatsApp, which is the largest end-to-end encrypted service in the world. We're running Messenger, which is another one of the largest messaging systems in the world, where encryption is an option, but it isn't the default. I don't think long term it really makes sense to be running different systems with very different policies on this. I think this is like sort of a philosophical question where you want to figure out where you want to be on it. And so my question for you, and then I'll talk about how I'm thinking about this, is all right, if you were in my position and you got to flip a switch is probably too glib because there's a lot of work that goes into this, and go in one direction for both of those services, how would you think about that?
Well, the question you're putting on the table, which is a hard one, is it okay, and let's just take the simple case, for two people to communicate with each other in a way that makes it difficult for any third party to casually listen in? Is that okay? And I think the way we normally answer that question is kind of a form of what you might call status quoism, which is not satisfying. It's whatever has been the case is what should stay the case. And so for WhatsApp, it's like, right now, WhatsApp, as I understand it, you could correct me if I'm wrong, is pretty hard to get into. If Facebook,
it's fully end-to-end encrypted.
Right. So Facebook gets handed a subpoena or a warrant or something from name your favorite country, and you're just like, thank you for playing. We have nothing for you.
Yeah. We've had employees thrown in jail because we have gotten court orders that we have to turn over data that we wouldn't probably anyway, but we can't because it's encrypted.
Yes. And then on the other hand, and this is not as clean as it could be in theory, but Messenger is sometimes encrypted, sometimes not. If it doesn't happen to have been encrypted by the users, then that subpoena could work. And more than that, there could start to be some automated systems, either on Facebook's own initiative or under pressure from governments in the general case, not a specific warrant, to say, hey, if the following phrases appear,